Hi, this is F. Paul Driscoll with another episode of Sightlines for Opera News. My guest today is Dr. Derrell Acon, and his many activities include being the board president and one of the founders of the Black Opera Alliance. He is associate artistic director and creative producer at Heartbeat Opera, and is also the vice president of people operations and inclusion at Opera Philadelphia, and maintains an active career as a bass baritone. And I just saw him in Heartbeat's production of Fidelio at the Metropolitan Museum of Art on Saturday night here in New York, and he is about to embark on a tour with Heartbeat. So welcome, Derrell. Thank you so much for making time for us. You're a very busy gentleman.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Paul. Thanks for having me.
So I have a big question right at the front. I mean, you had not necessarily a traditional education, but looking at it on paper, you were an undergrad at Lawrence. You had 2 bachelor's degrees, if I'm correct.
Yes.
Then you went on to CCM for master's and doctorate. Now, a lot of people have a similar trajectory and go into teaching or into performing. You have a much, much bigger picture. When did that start? When did you start looking at the possibility of working for diversity, equity, and inclusion in this field?
I would say immediately is when I became interested in that work, not necessarily knowing that I would eventually have a title that involved EDI more specifically. But as you said, the careers, the trajectories of many folks in this field are determined by your schooling, and oftentimes not only by your schooling, but the specific school you go to can determine how you're going to be. And for me, I immediately knew that in terms of what I want to put out into the world, that trajectory would not allow enough agency for that. And so I decided to do the performance thing, but then along the path, I kept adding additional hats just to make sure that all that I feel I can give, not only to this field, but to society as someone who's a big, passionate advocate for justice, that I have enough space to do that.
But I'm fascinated to know, how did you make that possible for yourself and create partnerships, not only within your community as a singer, as a Black man, as a gay man, but you have many partners who are outside those smaller worlds. How did you begin those partnerships?
For me, it's courage. A lot of times, for example, a lot of the partners or colleagues I have in ethnic studies come from a lot of work that I've done as a panelist or as a presenter at conferences. And so, folks, I go there and they see my work, and oftentimes it's a performance presentation and they're very intrigued. And so we keep in touch, and someone will hire me for something else. Or in opera specifically, I will consult with the company, and folks there may see me, or I'm in conversation with board members. And so they become a part of my network. And I think when you're involved with as many different types of activity in the arts as I am, like the kinds of people who come into contact with what you're doing is very widespread, right? And so, the folks along the way who have been able to put me in front of a different pair of eyes. And if I find that that's going to be a pair of eyes that's going to be effective and productive with what I'm trying to do, I don't say no to a lot of opportunities. I mean, these days I say no, but literally only because I don't have the time to do it, but not because I don't have the interest.
When you're working with a company, whether as a staff member or if you're called in to consult, is there a least common denominator in the way companies face or don't face or are not able to face or are able to face this issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion?
I would say if there's anything that is similar across the board, it is the difference across an organization in terms of the dynamics. Oftentimes the young folks who are entry level or mid level are the most quote unquote woke and like energized about doing this work. Those folks who are in upper leadership, managerial positions, even directorial positions, executive positions, a lot of them are wanting to do this work and wanting to represent their companies well in the field, but they're balancing a ton of different variables, not only in terms of their boards, but also in terms of their respective communities. And then when you get to the board, a lot of which are all white and about all in the same age range, then just the energy, the excitement around doing this work is much more disappointing in my experience. And oftentimes executive directors, general directors are having to not force, but really advocate for the importance of this work in boards. Whereas with most staff folks, they want to do that almost more than their leaders do.
What is the typical experience for you if you're working with a board? I mean, I'm not asking you to talk about a specific company, but if you're dealing with a group of board members, how do you approach this issue?
I will say how I approach it, but I will just start with the caveat that a lot of EDI consultant specialists approach this differently. And part of my work is disruption and radical approaches, because I feel like there is such a calibration that happens when we try to do this work. Like if say it's around Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement, we go a little bit in that direction of advocacy, of activism, and then the system recalibrates back into normalcy. And I try to work against that specifically. And so my approach is I go into most rooms and really am very candid about what are the issues. White supremacy is a major issue in terms of the structures that are built around us. And so if we're not all completely aware of what that means, its effects, the implications, and how we need anti-racist structures and a specificity around the approaches, the strategies that we're implementing, then we don't have a shot at changing anything. Knowing the terminology, knowing what equity and diversity mean by definition is not enough. And so what often happens with me, whereas a lot of consultants will get into these rooms and have sort of an air of like, everybody's opinion matters about this. And so I want to be here as a therapist so we can all just share our opinions. I come in really as an expert, not only as an expert in the EDI field, but also an expert strategy who has, consulted at the executive level. And so I come in also as a strategist and someone with human resources experience saying, based on my expert perspective, these are the main issues at your organization, and these are my recommendations. And now I would like to be in conversation about those, as opposed to creating a space where everyone feels like because they have 3 Black friends, that means that their company is not suffering from any acts of white supremacist culture, or because, they did not grow up with a lot of money, that somehow they are not experiencing the privilege that is barring a lot of other folks from having access to certain spaces. That for me is important. I think, unfortunately, it's quite a radical move, because I think too many of my consulting colleagues do almost the opposite of trying to really become friends with folks to the point where they kind of trick them into learning these about these systems. I really just lay it out there as someone who has been hired for a very specific reason.
Are arts organizations different in terms of how you have to present this cultural picture than a regular corporation or a regular for-profit company?
Absolutely. And, I will say I have not done a ton of work in the for-profit world, but a lot of the scholarship that exists comes out of that space because there's a lot of funding there. And so, yes, it's very different. The most primary way it's different, which is different, is that we're far behind. We don't, I released this report on equity in place last year, meaning to like catch us up on what exists. What do we know about diversity? You know, for years, there were folks who felt like if you were trying specifically if you're trying to implement efforts, strategies that were specifically around increasing diversity, that somehow was wrong. But now what the scholarship is telling us is actually that helps your bottom line as well. And so it's a productive decision. It's a productive thing organizationally to figure out. We don't even have that part down. You know, when I was working at Long Beach Opera, not too long ago, one of the things I did was I really tried to align the work we were doing in terms of community engagement, in terms of the EDI space, with how those same people who were at the free conversations were now new ticket buyers, right? And I have colleagues throughout the country now who are doing similar work. And I think more of that will come about, but also the theoretical framing of how anti-racism is meant to function, how tokenistic behaviors at organizations have, you know, such an adverse effect on the productivity of employees, something that as we're thinking about the bottom line or, you know, the efficiency of our companies, that should be in our mind, but it's not. For a lot of my arts colleagues, they think of the idea of producing art and this thing that's happening right now in EDI that we all have to pay attention to, but it's going to pass in a few years. And what I have committed to is that I, and along with several other people in the field, will not allow it to just pass by. We have to take some learnings out of this. We have to systemically change so many things in this field. And so that's really my goal.
Do you have a primary goal or a number one thing that you want to change, or is that too big a question at this point with all of the issues facing you?
I really, if I could change anything with the snap of a finger, it would be to diversify boards like immediately. It has huge effects, but that's not going to happen overnight, unfortunately. Right. My goal that I think I can achieve personally, is really having us all be on the same page about what the metrics are. How do you know if you are authentically an anti-racist organization or, you know, on the other end of that, or do you just know the definition of anti-racism, but you are not doing anything systematically to change the barriers in your organization working against that. And I think through organizations like Black Opera Alliance, now Asian Opera Alliance, the Soloist Coalition, Opera America, and more of the ways in which they're advocating for this racial justice work with the RJON, Racial Justice Opera Network. These are opportunities for us all to publicly hold the field accountable to the metrics. And then what the public will do as Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all these various social media platforms become more and more popular, as we're seeing, then there will be a clearer set of standards, a clearer set of benchmarks that we can say, oh, this company is doing very poorly at, you know, diversifying their board or diversifying upper leadership, whereas this company, even though it's smaller, they're nailing it. So why don't we support them? What are the ways in which we can support them? You know, instead of Instagram stories, instead of creating a TikTok account for them, you know, and I think now that kind of thinking feels silly to a lot of executives at these companies because they're so used to the old way of doing things. But what I'm seeing, you know, as someone who's on TikTok and happens to love TikTok, and what's happening in corporate world where they're hiring and paying tens of thousands of dollars for social media influencers, is right. that is what is coming up for us. And we're behind, and so we haven't arrived there quite yet. But it's the job of folks like me, the strategists, to anticipate that and to build our structures so that we are ready for it when it happens.
Can you talk about the Black Opera Alliance and how it was founded? Whose idea was it? And what is it that it does and hopes to do?
Absolutely. Well, the Black Opera Alliance, I will first start off by saying it's my heart. This was an organization that came about as a surprise to many of us. No one was expecting to start an organization. But what happened was when the lockdown of the pandemic first began in earnest, a lot of Black folks got together, and the first premise was that a lot of older, more established, some famous opera singers would be in conversation with younger, up-and-coming opera singers as to answer questions, to give advice, to give tips, all of these things. But what it became was this big communal discussion about the elements at play in this industry that are preventing a lot of the careers, not only of the up and coming folks, but even the full comprehensive success of those who are more established of happening. And so we started a Facebook group where folks are talking about different strategies, different ways in which we can come together as a collective to try to move some of those systems, to support each other, to create opportunity where opportunity doesn't exist. And as we became more known, because, part of our strategy was becoming a presence on social media. And,
Sure.
we were like thousands of followers, over a few weeks. And so we said, oh, there is some power here. There is an opportunity here for us to have a voice in this industry. Companies, colleagues, Opera America folks were starting to come to us and as a resource. And so what we decided to do was let's make that more official. Let's start an organization. It began with a set of leaders. Those leaders decided that this was not what they signed up for. So then some other folks, including myself, Rayanne Bryce Davis, mezzo soprano, Alicia Fox, soprano, we really were the trio that said, okay, this group deserves to exist and it deserves to continue to flourish. And so, by co-founding, what that meant was just operating at first, what that meant was operating the Facebook page. And then I took upon myself, with the permission of the full community, which now is over 1,000 people, to incorporate the organization to ensure that we could receive nonprofit, we could allow for tax-free donations and all of that good stuff. And, building the board out, creating a leadership structure that felt that it could keep the organization efficient, but also take in the full synthesis of community opinion, because we're trying to be an organization that really is community centered. If you look at our website, for example, we tried to get away from even naming those people who are in leadership positions, with the understanding that we are wanting to center our community. That's how our work is done. No, there's no one person making all of the decisions and passing them down. It's completely the opposite. And in terms of what we hope to achieve, what we've already achieved is this visibility that I'm talking about, this the importance of the public being involved. I think Black Opera Alliance has been one of the main proponents of social media accountability. And now organizations, companies are seeing how powerful it is. Even something as simple as our system of saying whether a company has signed our pledge or is in progress of signing our pledge or has not signed our pledge. That simple mechanism itself has created such a conversation through that mechanism, through us being in conversations with general directors about where they are in their progress. I've been face to face with over 35 general directors at companies of various sizes, from as large as the Met, down to companies that have one or two people on staff. And it has really given this organization an opportunity to synthesize all of those different perspectives, all of those different sets of problematic variables at play, problematic board perspectives that are happening. And really, the more we have those conversations, the more robust our opinion, the more robust our advice becomes with colleagues. And so, whereas some folks, I think, looked at us as sort of this radical, disrupting entity that was just there to make noise, now more and more colleagues are really understanding that because of the ways in which we do our work, we are a major resource, because we've heard from so many people and been in conversation with so many people that we have a lot of information about how a lot of this can roll forward more productively.
So I have two questions about your life as a performer, if this isn't too much of a
Please, feel free.
twist. On the Heartbeat opera, Fidelio, which was originally produced in 2018 and is now being revised, however, how did your perspective towards the piece and specifically to this production change, you as a performer?
Yeah.
Because it is so timely now. I mean, it's hard to believe that as an idea, it's more than 4 years old.
Yeah.
It seems as if it could have been thought of last week, but
Yeah.
was that revision and revisiting it, was it something that was difficult for you, or was it something that felt very positive?
You know, I don't look at it as positive or negative, but it felt needed and it felt productive and powerful, right? Doing the show for the first time, first of all, you know, my doctorate, as we talked about, is in 19th century opera history and performance.
Yeah.
And so this is something I'm always thinking about anyway. How do the classics function in our contemporary discourse? And of course, for someone like me, who is primarily an activist, how do we disrupt those classics in order to bring out the heart? You know, when I think about, you know, 1830s and 40s, Viva Verdi was what we will hear being screamed on the streets, because opera, Giuseppe Verdi, those kinds of conversations, what was happening on the operatic stage, on these classical stages, was at the center of public discourse. That is the power of opera. And I think we've in so many ways moved away from that. And now it's this, you know, shielded museum for only a very small group of people. And that's not really how opera is meant to function. And so when we did Fidelio in 2018, that's how I was approaching it. I was so excited that this small company in New York City had chosen to take this opera, Fidelio, an opera about which I, you know, had studied a ton, and put a little part of me in there, you know, a little part of Blackness. The Black Lives Matter movement was something that was really then only starting to come into a positive light in some circles, and frankly still was in quite a negative light for a lot of folks. And so it made sense in that regard, and that this was a way to disrupt the classic for a productive end. What has happened since then is my own understanding of the systems that the piece is meant to highlight, is meant to critique, has changed. You know, even something as simple as abolitionism was something back then I did not know a ton about. As it relates to the prison industrial complex. But this concept that is championed by folks like Angela Davis and Gina Dent and quite a few others, mostly women of color, was something I didn't know about. But now that I really know the atrocities of this system, and I really understand that the numbers are telling us that even the arguments that are being made about why this system needs to exist in our society, they're not supported. No one can point to data telling us that this system is changing anyone's life, is making us any safer, is, you know, taking the numbers of violent crimes that happen, making that number smaller. None of these things are happening. And yet we still allow this system that is so inherently unjust, that is so inherently is brutal towards the lives of Black and brown people specifically, disproportionately, we still allowed it to exist. And I think is one of the key examples of how far behind we are in terms of dismantling white supremacy in this country. And so when I came into the opera this time around, that is my framework. Even our opening night, I moderated a panel, which was crazy that I did a show and didn't moderate a panel, but I did. And the title of that panel was Radical Love as Resistance. And I brought together 4 abolitionists, one being Michael Powell, who sang in the chorus of Fidelio. And now, he's on the outside and was able to join us as an audience member and see himself as an actor, which I just found so profound. This was Charity Chandler Cole from LA, Donna Hilton, who's a very, very fantastic voice, as well as Lisette Bamenga from the Initiative for Just Society out of Columbia University in New York City. And the whole premise of the conversation was, what is abolition democracy? What don't we know? What we know is that only 15% of people agree with an abolitionist framework. Why is that? What can we do in this panel discussion to change some minds? Because I really think that's where we all should go. So when I think about something as simple as my character as Rock in this piece, the massive ambivalence that he experienced, the difficulty, the conflict that he experiences, it makes more sense to me. It makes more sense that this person who does want the best, who does value love and justice for his daughter and wants to pass those things along, is also complicit in a system that is brutalizing a Black body. And what became most evident for me, that it would take a major occurrence, a miracle, as it were, a deus ex machina, as it were, to get him in a position where he actually had the agency to no longer be complicit in that system. And that was, of course, the arrival of Leah in our version, or Fidelio in the original Beethoven.
One point of clarification for the people watching this who may not have seen the Heartbeat Opera production is that the prisoner's chorus in Fidelio is sung by men and women who are incarcerated in a number of institutions in the United States, and they're seen on film singing in German and singing in harmony. And it's wonderful. I mean, it's really the heart, with all due respect to the people who are singing live. I mean, it's the heart of the performance.
Yeah, we agree. We agree.
The last question I have for you, as a performer, when you're wearing that hat, I've noticed that, especially the past couple of projects with the opera about the Central Park Five and this, and also Sweetland, are you choosing your projects as a performer differently than you would have, you think, 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I've gotten to this place, and I must admit, it has not been on purpose, but it works in my advantage, where I don't need to actively go out and seek out work, because there's so much stuff going on that I will be just fine if I just keep doing what I'm doing. And so when it comes to performance and folks approach me with the project, there has to be some alignment with what I'm trying to do as an artist, with what I'm trying to do as an activist. And as I love that you named those 3 in the same sentence, because that is absolutely right. These are the projects, even amongst the mountain of other activity that I have going on, have felt compelling enough, poignant enough, powerful enough for me to say, this is the next artistic solo performance project I want to involve myself in, even if it means moving around some of the other activity. I mean, I'm literally still onboarding as a senior manager at one of the top opera companies in the country, and yet I'm on tour with this Fidelio. And it's because not only am I choosing wisely in terms of the performance projects I take on, but also the work, and so I have a fantastic leader and David Devan, someone who understands his work so beautifully well. And so, he gets what I'm trying to achieve. He gets the uniqueness of my position in this industry and the weirdness of it. And so we make it work. And I think that's part of being creative. That's part of being an artist. I wish, frankly, more people would embrace a portfolio approach to this art form.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for right now, but this has been a wonderful conversation. It's a privilege to talk to you about your work, and I wish you safe travels, first of all, on the tour, and all success in your work at Heartbeat and at Opera Philadelphia and any place else that's lucky enough to have your services. This is F. Paul Driscoll, and my guest today has been Derrell Acon, and thank you very much for being with us. This is another episode of Sightlines for Opera News.